Tens of thousands of lives were lost to an accusation that could be manufactured in a single breath, a neighbor's spite, a child's dream, or a priest's interpretation of a bruise. This video pulls back the curtain on how societies turned invisible fears into legal proof, not by discovering magic, but by inventing methods to make magic visible. Watch because you'll learn exactly how proof was constructed. A dying cow becomes evidence of maleficium, a sudden illness becomes a spectral attack. Investigators probed bodies for the devil's mark, watched for fits and convulsions, and treated a reluctant denial as proof of guilt. Under torture, confessions were carved out and embroidered, pacts with the devil, naming familiars, nocturnal flights, details that inquisitors then used to confirm what they already believed. Spectral evidence, visions of an accused tormenting a victim, could be offered in court as if it were solid fact, because witnesses swore their visions were caused by the accused spirit. We'll analyze the Malleus Maleficarum not as a dusty curiosity but as a handbook, written in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. It taught magistrates how to spot witches, recommended interrogation and torture, and argued theology as legal procedure. It turned suspicion into a repeatable technique, a checklist that transformed rumor and rivalry into legal conviction. You'll meet the informers and the self-styled experts, neighbors with grudges, children with attention, midwives blamed for infant deaths, and professional witch hunters who claimed special skills, witch prickers, demonologists, and inquisitors whose methods standardized accusation across regions. Their incentives mattered: land disputes, personal vendettas, or religious zeal could become testimony. Finally, we'll compare Europe's long, bureaucratic hunts with Salem's fevered American outbreak in 1692. Continental inquisitorial courts relied openly on torture and manuals like the Malleus. English heritage courts in New England relied heavily on spectral evidence and the testimonies of young accusers, producing a different pattern of panic and a different legal aftermath. Together, these threads explain not just what happened, but how ordinary institutions and people created an invisible enemy, and why understanding those mechanics matters today. Stay with me to see the techniques, the turning points, and the human cost behind the trials against an invisible foe. Systemic ideological engine. The Inquisition institutionalized fear as a tool to eliminate dissent, cathars, and enforce doctrinal purity, creating a self-perpetuating bureaucracy of terror funded by confiscated property. The Inquisition turned doctrinal policing into an administrative engine by channeling the assets of the accused into the coffers that sustained prosecutors, tribunals, and prisons. Confiscation was not merely incidental, it was institutionalized. When a person was condemned as heretic or witch, their household goods, land, and savings could be seized and used to pay inquisitorial expenses. That created a perverse incentive structure. Local authorities and ecclesiastical courts then had budgets and power that depended in part on a steady stream of convictions, and over time the search for heresy and witchcraft became profitable as well as pious. Proof of a diabolical connection was manufactured through standardized rituals of investigation and interrogation designed to produce confessions or corroborating signs. In practice, this meant looking for supposed physical marks, the so-called witch's teat or devil's mark, examining skin for insensitive patches, and subjecting suspects to pricking to find a spot that would not bleed. Interrogation techniques ranged from long, leading questioning to outright torture, and both were justified as ways to force the demon to reveal itself. Accusations of pacts with the devil were constructed by eliciting confessions that described nocturnal assemblies, sacrilegious rites, and sexual or blasphemous encounters with invisible familiars or with a bound figure called the devil. Once a confession described such contacts, it was treated as confirmation rather than as the likely product of duress. Spectral evidence. The claim that an afflicted person had been tormented by the accused specter or apparition, functioned similarly, unverifiable, yet admissible in many courts. It could be asserted by an accuser and accepted by an inquisitor as proof of a spiritual alliance with malign forces. The Malleus Maleficarum operated as an explicit instruction manual for these procedures, codifying both theology and method for inquisitors and secular magistrates. Penned by Dominican clerics, it argued that witchcraft was real, propagated by female frailty, and that legal and spiritual authorities had both the right and duty to root it out. It recommended investigative steps, recommended the use of torture under controlled conditions, and provided legalistic arguments to overcome skepticism among judges. The text offered detailed suggestions for extracting confessions, discrediting recantations, and interpreting ambiguous signs as indicative of a diabolical pact. Because it circulated widely and was translated and cited by clergy and magistrates, the Malleus standardized accusatory language and investigative norms across different jurisdictions, turning local suspicion into a repeatable, bureaucratic procedure. Informers and self-styled experts became the operational arm of that bureaucracy. Neighbors, servants, and vendetta-minded relatives supplied accusations, often motivated by petty feuds, property disputes, or social envy, and these testimonies were treated as evidentiary seeds to be cultivated by inquisitors. Professional witch hunters, prickers, and demonologists offered services or authoritative interpretations. Men like Matthew Hopkins in England styled themselves as specialists, traveling to take commissions. Doctors and theologians wrote treatises interpreting fits and afflictions as signs of demonic activity. In colonial New England, ministers and local authorities lent moral and legal weight to accusations. Cotton Mather's writings, for example, defended the notion of visible and invisible maleficence even as others questioned evidentiary standards. The interaction of amateur informants and credentialed experts allowed suspicion to crystallize into formal charges, because the presence of a learned interpreter made everyday grievance legible as heresy or witchcraft. Trials in Europe and in Salem shared techniques but differed in institutional context and consequences. European inquisitorial courts often operated within church hierarchies, used torture with relative routine, and had formal processes for delegating inquisitors and seizing assets. Public autos de fe displayed both the punishment and the spoils of conviction. By contrast, the Salem prosecutions unfolded within a Puritan civic framework where spectral evidence, child accusers, and community panic played an outsized role. The legal culture of English common law there created a different set of debates about admissible evidence. In Europe, the confiscation of goods fed a durable tribunal infrastructure, which encouraged sustained campaigns against groups like the Cathars and other dissenters. In Salem, property seizure was not the same systemic funding mechanism, and local political pushback, legal counsel, and clergy skepticism eventually helped curtail the prosecutions. Individual episodes illuminate the differences. Enslaved and marginalized figures could be coerced into confession and then used to implicate others, as happened in New England, while continental inquisitorial procedures often turned confessions into public spectacles that reinforced the authority, and the finances, of ecclesiastical institutions. Taken together, these elements created a self-reinforcing engine. Manuals and doctrines legitimized methods, informers and specialists operationalized them, courts and confiscatory incentives sustained them. Accusation produced assets, assets sustained apparatus, and apparatus produced more accusations. The human cost was immense: coerced confessions, ruined reputations, and seized homes. Institutional fear thus became not only a theological stance but a functioning bureaucracy of terror, replicated across jurisdictions by texts, practices, and economic incentives that made persecution both plausible and profitable. The blueprint for hysteria, the Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, provided a pseudo-legal and theological manual that codified misogynistic superstition into a judicial framework, making witchcraft a prosecutable heresy and standardizing the witch hunt across Europe. Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger wrote a tightly argued handbook that pretended to be legal theology and was rapidly treated as practical counsel by magistrates and inquisitors. It claimed ecclesiastical authority behind its prescriptions, citing papal endorsement to bolster its reach, and it was published and circulated in print so that local courts could consult the same checklists. The manual singled out certain social types, especially older, impoverished, or sexually nonconforming women, as predisposed to diabolic influence, and it translated theological speculation about pacts with the devil into concrete questions for prosecutors and judges. Read as an instruction manual, its structure is chillingly methodical. Definitions of witchcraft and diabolism are followed by lists of symptoms and suggested proofs, then by recommended interrogations, procedural justifications for using torture, and legal rationales to overcome clerical skepticism. It provided sample lines of questioning, advised how to interpret evasive denials, and offered theological cover for treating ambiguous physical marks or neighborhood gossip as admissible evidence. Courts that adopted this script found it easier to turn rumor into charges. The manual normalized rhetorical techniques that made guilt appear logical and unavoidable to onlookers who wanted certainty. Proof was constructed by design, not discovered by accident. The manual and its imitators directed searchers to seek the devil's mark, and those who performed the searches used pricking needles or knives to show insensible spots. A painless prick was then presented as physical confirmation of a compact with the devil. Confessions were cultivated through a combination of prolonged interrogation and judicially sanctioned torture, which the manual rationalized as necessary to extract truth from lying suspects. Once a confession of intercourse with a demon existed, it was treated as the linchpin that made all other testimony cohere. Ordinary misfortunes, failed harvests, sudden illnesses, miscarriages, spoiled milk, were narrated as maleficium, and neighbors' reports of quarrels or odd behavior were collected, repeated, and given weight until they stitched a pattern of culpability. Spectral evidence, claims that an afflicted person had been visited by the accused apparition, could be admitted under the reasoning the manual encouraged, especially when corroborated by a string of community complaints or a coerced confession. Informers and so-called experts became essential cogs in the machinery the manual described. Village informers, often motivated by grudges, rent disputes, or promised rewards, provided the initial accusations. Itinerant witch-finders and professional pricksters offered an appearance of technical validation, showing marks or claiming to read signs that ordinary people could not. Clerical figures and theologians functioned as expert interpreters, framing the accusations in doctrinal terms and advising magistrates on what counts as diabolic intent. Physicians and midwives were sometimes called to speak on likely natural causes. At other times they were pressed into testifying against suspects. Conclusions shifted with social pressure. In New England, children acted as reliable accusers in many prosecutions, their testimonies amplified by ministers and magistrates. On the continent, paid witch hunters and inquisitorial teams fulfilled a similar role, moving from village to village and leaving procedural templates behind. Comparisons with the Salem prosecutions reveal both continuity and divergence. Trials in Europe often followed inquisitorial procedure, where torture and exhaustive confession extraction were routine and executions could be mass events. The manual's printed instructions fit naturally into that environment and helped standardize questioning across jurisdictions. In Salem, courts did not employ judicial torture, but they adopted other elements, most notably the acceptance, for a time, of spectral evidence and the elevation of the afflicted's testimony into near-decisive proof. Colonial magistrates and Puritan ministers supplied the theological framing in place of an inquisitor's imprimatur, while local rivalries, frontier anxieties, and a network of child accusers created the social conditions that the manual anticipated. Over time, however, skepticism, fueled by clergy who cautioned against spectral evidence and by civil authorities who feared miscarriages of justice, led to procedural reversals that were less common in many parts of Europe where the manual's model remained entrenched. The lasting effect of that handbook was procedural. It transformed fear into forensic practice by giving accusers, informers, and judges a common playbook. Once community suspicion could be translated into the legal language the manual provided, marks, confessions, expert attestations, the machinery of prosecution could be replicated in townships and courts far from its authors, and local conflicts acquired the juridical form of heresy and crime. The science of extraction. The process was designed to produce a specific outcome, confession. Tests, like trial by water or needle, served as public proofs of guilt, while systematic torture was the core technique to extract the necessary admissions, turning the accused into the source of their own condemnation. In many witch trials, the so-called proof of a compact with the devil was not a single piece of physical evidence so much as a constructed narrative assembled from disparate, suggestive elements that, taken together, became convincing within the court's logic. A blemish or mole on the body could be declared a witch's mark, because it did not bleed when pricked. An unexplained illness in a neighbor's cattle became maleficia attributed to secret malice. A confession, especially one obtained after prolonged interrogation, was treated as the ultimate corroboration, and once a defendant named a familiar or a pact and described nocturnal meetings, those descriptions were transcribed and circulated as objective proof. The repertoire of signs, witches' marks, familiars, pacts, nocturnal sabbaths, and uncanny knowledge of future events, was flexible and cumulative, and interrogators assembled these clues in ways that made guilt appear inevitable. Torture was central to that assembly. It was not merely punitive, it was procedural, engineered to produce a controlled outcome, a confession that fitted the investigators' expectations. Short. Techniques varied from the strappado and rack to thumbscrews and sleep deprivation, depending on local law and the whim of magistrates, but the technique was consistent: escalate pressure, break resistance, then shape the confession through leading questions. After a body had been searched and pricked for insensitivities, or after an accused had been observed failing a prayer test, a period of isolation or interrogation would follow, and then the application of physical constraint aimed at making denial impossible. The Malleus Maleficarum functioned as a procedural template for many of these practices, offering judges and inquisitors a manualized justification for aggressive methods. Written by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, it combined theological argument with practical instructions: how to elicit confessions, how to interpret ambiguous signs, and how to rebut skeptical legal protections, thus lowering the bar for what counted as admissible evidence. Short. Its rhetoric positioned confession as the crown jewel of proof and advised that when the accused denied, one should not automatically believe the denial, rather, one should presume obfuscation and proceed to interrogation and, if necessary, torture to unmask the truth. Informers and self-styled experts filled in the investigative gaps and amplified the machinery of accusation. Professional witch-finders, who traveled for fees and advertised techniques like pricking for the devil's mark, supplied theatrical demonstrations of proof that could sway local courts. Local informers, neighbors, servile household members, or vengeful acquaintances, provided testimony about suspicious behavior, quarrels, or misfortunes. In New England, accusers included children whose dramatic fits and identifications became pivotal evidence in hearings. Short. Their statements were treated as factual corroboration because they could be woven into the broader narrative of maleficium and pact-making. Comparisons between European inquisitorial practices and the Salem prosecutions highlight how different legal cultures shaped the science of extraction. In many parts of Europe, formal procedures and manuals like the Malleus encouraged physical torture as an established tool, and confessions extracted under duress were often required for conviction. That system tended to generate long lists of accused as one confession led to many more. The professionalization of terror, witch hunting became a credentialed profession, with hunters paid per conviction. This economic incentive, combined with judicial farces that inverted justice, where denial was proof of devilry, guaranteed a steady supply of guilty victims. Witch hunting evolved into a marketable trade in many regions, and some practitioners treated it as a business. In England, figures like Matthew Hopkins styled themselves as Witchfinder General and traveled from parish to parish offering services for a fee. In continental courts, local officials sometimes relied on hired searchers or contracted inquisitors whose income or reputation depended on producing convictions. Payments could come in cash, in fees for arrests and examinations, or indirectly through the confiscation of a condemned person's goods, which created a direct economic motive to secure a guilty verdict. The logic was simple: a steady stream of convictions meant repeat business and social prestige for witch hunters, while courts and communities could point to the visible results of prosecutions as proof of their vigilance against diabolism. Proof of satanic connection was not discovered so much as manufactured according to widely accepted procedures and prejudices. Spectral evidence, testimony that an accused specter or shape appeared to an afflicted person, functioned as airtight proof in some tribunals because it could not be directly contradicted. Denial by the accused only reinforced the claim that the devil was concealing them. Physical signs were likewise read as decisive. Insensitive patches or devil's marks on the skin were probed by prickers, who used needles or bodkins to find non-bleeding spots and presented those findings to judges as incontrovertible marks of a pact with the devil. Ordeals such as the swimming test inverted ordinary logic. Floating was interpreted as proof that the accused was rejected by the element and therefore allied to evil. Sinking often meant near drowning but could be spun as exoneration or, cruelly, leave the community indifferent. Confession, when obtained, ended trials quickly, and because confessions were typically elicited through sleep deprivation, leading questioning, threats, or torture, the proof of guilt was often a coerced narrative that matched interrogators' expectations. The Malleus Maleficarum functioned as an operational manual for many of these procedures. Written by Heinrich Kramer and historically associated with Jacob Sprenger, it compiled theological, legal, and practical arguments to persuade judges and inquisitors that witchcraft was real, pervasive, and a female-dominated crime. The text laid out how to interrogate suspects, how to interpret ambiguous signs, and how to use theological doctrine to justify inquisitorial methods. It counseled judges to presume the reality of diabolical agency and to treat evasiveness as evidence of collusion with the devil. Medical symptoms and domestic disputes were reframed as diabolical workings. Its influence came not only from its arguments but from its specificity. It offered step-by-step treatments of evidence, suggested questions for eliciting confessions, and endorsed the use of torture under certain procedural rubrics, thereby professionalizing a set of tactics that produced convictions with regularity. Informers and so-called experts formed the connective tissue between popular accusation and judicial action. Neighbors, servants, and children frequently served as primary accusers. Their testimonies could be driven by grudges, competition for land or marriage prospects, or hopes of social advancement. Midwives and herbalists were obvious targets because their knowledge set them apart and made them vulnerable to charges of secret arts. To legitimize community claims, courts imported experts, demonologists, theologians, physicians, and witch prickers, whose technical-sounding procedures conferred a veneer of scientific or legal objectivity on otherwise circumstantial accusations. These experts often had financial and reputational incentives aligned with conviction: a pricker's pay, a theologian's publication prospects, or a physician's elevated social standing could rise with the number of cases they helped to close. The result was a feedback loop in which suspicious behavior prompted an expert evaluation that almost always produced the kind of proof the court expected. Comparing continental Europe and Salem highlights both common mechanisms and different institutional configurations. In many parts of Europe, local courts and inquisitorial bodies made use of established professionals, traveling witch hunters, prickers, and theological consultants, and had legal procedures that tolerated or institutionalized torture, which increased the likelihood of confessions and thus convictions. Trials there were often embedded in bureaucratic and fiscal structures that could reward detection and punishment. The Salem prosecutions, by contrast, featured fewer itinerant professionals and more reliance on local ministers and accusers within a tight-knit community. Spectral evidence played an outsized role because physical torture was not part of New England legal practice. Accusations in Salem were largely driven by a coalition of young accusers and religious leaders whose interpretations of fits and visions were treated as admissible testimony. Outcomes diverged as well, where European procedures sometimes produced long campaigns with many executions supported by professional apparatuses. The Salem episode collapsed under local skepticism and later censure once authorities questioned the reliability of spectral testimony and the motives of accusers. Across both settings, however, the same structural incentives, economic gain for investigators, reputational benefits for experts, and legal rules that privileged certain kinds of ambiguous proof, guaranteed that accusation could be mechanically transformed into conviction. The mechanics of social collapse. Cases like Salem reveal the end-stage mechanics: a trigger, childhood hysteria, ignites latent social tensions. The judicial system adopts the role of prosecutor and executioner. Stake, noose, and self-perpetuating paranoia dismantles the community from within, leaving only ashes and remorse. When a cluster of children's fits erupted in a tight-knit settlement, they did more than alarm parents. They supplied a narrative that turned private fear into public accusation. The afflicted, often girls and adolescents, exhibited contortions, visions, and claims of being pinched or tormented by invisible forces. Short testimonies became incendiary evidence. Community members who were already entangled in land disputes, family feuds, or religious rivalries found a language to make grudges actionable. What followed was a predictable escalation: initial accusations, arrests, interrogations, and then confessions or spectral testimony that implicated others. The process fed on itself. Each new allegation validated the old ones and created pressure for still more names. Proof of a connection with the devil was rarely empirical in any modern sense. It was constructed out of ritualized signs, coerced statements, and culturally legible symbols. Spectral evidence claims that the accused apparition or shape tormented the afflicted, was treated as direct proof even though it relied entirely on subjective sensation. Physical marks on the body, described as insensitive blemishes or extra nipples, were labeled witch marks. They were sought by examiners who used needles and knives to test sensitivity. Confessions obtained under duress or the threat of severe punishment frequently contained the canonical tropes of diabolism, a pact, attendance at witches' sabbaths, familiars given as tokens, and the naming of a local minister or neighbor as accomplice. Ritual objects and tokens, puppets, purported devil's pacts, and charms, were presented as corroboration, and techniques like the witch cake in New England converted personal bodily fluids into forensic theater. None of these proofs required independent, falsifiable verification, they required only acceptance by a court or clergy. The Malleus Maleficarum functioned as an instruction manual for this machinery of accusation and adjudication. Framed as theological and legal argumentation, it argued that witches were an existential threat and set out a prosecutorial playbook: how to interrogate suspects, how to interpret ambiguous signs, and how to justify the use of secular punishment in service of spiritual purification. It reinforced a presumption of guilt by portraying witchcraft as inherently deceptive and by excusing harsh methods to extract the truth. Practical recommendations included searching for witch marks, employing professional examiners, and using leading questions to elicit confessions that fit doctrinal expectations. The text's misogynistic underpinnings, asserting women's supposed inconstancy and susceptibility to temptation, gave social sanction to targeting certain kinds of victims. In courts where inquisitorial procedures and learned clergy or legal professionals held sway, the Malleus offered a script that converted fear into legal action. Informers and experts occupied indispensable roles in turning suspicion into conviction. Neighbors, servants, and children served as informants. Their statements mattered because community members understood each other's reputations, alliances, and grudges. Incentives for informing were complex: removing a troublesome neighbor, gaining moral standing, or simply aligning with local authorities could all motivate accusations. Experts, demonologists, theologians, physicians, and professional witch prickers provided the veneer of specialized knowledge. Their pronouncements often settled disputes about credibility. A learned cleric's interpretation of fits or a medical man's diagnosis could tip a magistrate toward arrest. Yet expertise was uneven. Learned treatises supplied categories and expectations that shaped what witnesses reported, while itinerant prickers and charlatans fed the apparatus with physical proofs. The result was a negotiated authority in which technical-sounding rituals and scholarly texts validated popular anxieties. Comparisons between European and American trials reveal both continuity and divergence in collapse mechanics. European campaigns tended to be larger in scale, often driven by institutional inquisitions or state-sponsored hunts that used systematic torture and professional witch-finders. Burning at the stake was more common in continental Catholic regions. In contrast, colonial New England operated within the English common law framework. Formal torture was officially proscribed, execution by hanging was the practice sentence, and the social dynamics of smaller, frontier communities shaped accusations. Spectral evidence achieved particular prominence in Salem-style proceedings. The courtroom accepted visions and afflictions as legitimate testimony in a way less common on the continent. Nevertheless, the feedback loop, accusation leading to confession leading to further accusations, was universal. In both contexts, courts often collapsed prosecutorial and adjudicatory functions into a single process, effectively becoming instruments of communal purification rather than neutral arbiters of fact. The judicial system's dual role as investigator and executioner made reversal difficult once trials began. Courts that accepted confessions derived through coercion, embraced spectral testimony, or privileged the testimony of experts created legal incentives to continue prosecutions. Confession offered a paradoxical escape. It might save a life in the short term, but it also named accomplices and expanded the net. Accusers gained power, accused families lost property and status, religious leaders and magistrates who validated prosecutions became complicit. The social fabric tore along pre-existing fault lines: economic inequality, gender hierarchies, religious rivalries, and the machinery of law converted social tension into permanent loss. Regret and restitution sometimes followed later, but the immediate effect was the same across continents: reputations annihilated, families splintered, and communities left to reckon with the moral weight of what they had allowed. By the time the last bell tolled, proof of a connection with the devil had become a construction, a chain of accusation, interpretation and coercion dressed up as evidence. A suspicious neighbor's word, an odd rattle of illness, a mark on the skin called a devil's teat, a dream of a spectral figure, each small thing was fitted into a theory that assumed guilt. Interrogation and torture turned rumor into confession, confessions produced names, names produced more arrests. Experts, inquisitors, demonologists, witch prickers, read the signs and declared them meaningful. In court, the pattern was treated as demonstration, spectral visions counted as real testimony, physical oddities as marks of a pact, and any resistance as proof of obstinacy to God. The Malleus Maleficarum functioned as an instruction manual for that process. Published with the authority of learned men, it taught magistrates and clergy how to identify, interrogate and secure convictions. It fused theology with legal procedure, normalized torture, codified misogynistic assumptions, and offered step-by-step guidance on discrediting defenses. Where local custom or human compassion might have slowed a prosecution, this text gave tools and confidence, technical methods to turn suspicion into sentence. Informers and experts were not neutral technicians. Informers could be neighbors, kin, or children with grudges or incentives. Their accusations reshaped social relations under pressure. Experts, from university-trained demonologists to itinerant witch-finders, translated ambiguous signs into stories of pacts and maleficium. Their authority made the invisible visible and the alleged impossible to disprove. In short, the machinery of accusation required people willing to point, and people willing to call that pointing proof. Compare Europe and Salem and you see the same engine working in different gears. European trials ran across centuries, varied by region, and often involved formal inquisitorial procedures, professional witch hunters, and long networks of rumor and law. Salem, in 1692, compressed panic into weeks, a small Puritan community, children's accusations, the acceptance of spectral evidence, lightning-fast prosecutions, and a later civic reckoning that included apologies and reparations. Different legal cultures, different scales, similar outcomes, fear met law and ordinary lives were consumed. Key points to take away: proof was manufactured through social pressure and legal tools, the Malleus Maleficarum institutionalized a playbook for persecution, informers and experts gave panic a language and legitimacy, and whether in European villages or in Salem's meetinghouses, witch trials reveal how communities can transform private fear into public violence. Think about the neighbor you'd trust, the court you'd expect to be fair, the evidence you'd demand. Imagine living where rumor could be law. If this history unsettles you, that's the point. Understanding these mechanisms helps us recognize modern echoes whenever accusation replaces due process. If you want to go deeper, we'll be unpacking key trials next, a close reading of Malleus passages, the Pendle and Torsaker prosecutions, and a line-by-line walk through the Salem court transcripts. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to follow the series, and check the description for sources we used. Help keep this history alive so the next generation can spot a witch hunt long before it starts.